Good evening. I'm Regina Strong from the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Thank you for joining us this evening for the second of 3 virtual town halls designed to help you understand important new regulations that affect our drinking water. I'm joined this evening by Erica Oswald from the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, and Corey Gresh from the Department of Health and Human Services. Tonight's event will run for about an hour and will include presentations on the new rule as well as public health. You will also have the opportunity to ask questions. You know, water is life, and cleaning up drinking water and protecting public health is a top priority for the state. We recognize that everyone wants to turn on the tap and have clean water to drink, and today's event reinforces our commitment to prioritizing every citizen's access to clean drinking water. Specifically, we'll be talking about a new regulation you may have heard about called the Lead and Copper Rule. The Lead and Copper Rule applies to public drinking water systems around our state and is designed to identify the amount of lead and copper in our drinking water. The new rule is more protective of public health than the rule it replaces. It looks deeper to identify elevated levels, and then, if higher levels are found, it requires public water suppliers to take specific actions, which we'll discuss more this evening. So to simplify, who could potentially be impacted by the new rule? I want to provide some context. If you receive a water bill, then this rule applies to the system that you pay for your water. However, if you receive water from a private well, then this new rule will not impact your water. So it's time to dive into our presentations. If you have questions during the presentations, please submit them by going to our website, michigan.gov/MI-LeadSafe, and clicking on the Submit Comment button. We're also recording the entire town hall and we'll post it on our website. Again, michigan.gov/MI-LeadSafe, following tonight's live event. Since this town hall is being viewed throughout the state of Michigan, we will be focusing on the new rule and its implications across the state. We will not be able to address questions about your specific water supply during this town hall. However, you can reach out to your local water department or Eagle staff at a later time to learn more specifics about your community. Well, let's get things started. I'd like to introduce Corey Gresh. Corey is the Environmental Public Health Director at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Well, thank you, Regina. So I will start off tonight and talk about the public health response that we will be doing to support the work on the new lead and copper rule data. So in a few minutes, I will turn this over to my colleague, Eric Oswald. There we go. We'll describe how public water supplies will be reporting their lead and copper drinking water results to the Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy under a new, more health protective set of drinking water rules. Some public water supply results will exceed the lead action level of 15 parts per billion. Now, in some cases, Eagle will have the public water supply do extra testing to discover why lead is exceeding the action level. Now, during lead action level exceedances, the state and local public health will be partnering with Eagle, public water supplies, and you to ensure everyone understands how to reduce the chance of having lead in their drinking water. This is because lead has the greatest risk of harming the fetuses, infants, and children. The public health response will include a safety net for providing filters, which supports the MDHHS recommendation that households with children or pregnant women purchase a certified filter that removes lead from the drinking water. If you are not able to afford that cost of the lead filter, please contact your public water supply and ask if they are providing that service. The contact information for your public water supply is likely on your billing statement. If the public water supply does not provide that service and you cannot afford the cost of a filter, and you have children or pregnant women in your household, please contact your local health department for assistance. Children or pregnant women on Medicaid or WIC do qualify for this filter assistance. Children are at greatest risk from swallowing lead, and as you can see on this slide, at even low levels, lead can harm brain development of fetuses, infants, and children. It can harm kidney function and can harm how their immune system functions. Any amount of lead in a child has a chance of causing harm. Even low levels of lead in blood have been associated with these harmful effects. Higher levels can add additional, more severe harm. For decades, public health has responded to elevated blood lead levels in children by working with in-need families to find and remove lead sources in their homes. As sources of lead are removed, child blood lead levels have come down over time. Now on this slide, what you see is data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention of blood lead levels in children between the ages of 1 and 5 years old. They've tested thousands of kids across the United States and found that back in 2000, the upper end of the level was 7 micrograms per deciliter. Now, that has declined to 2.8 micrograms per deciliter by 2016. The CDC and MDHHS use a blood level of 5 micrograms per deciliter, shown here as the red line, which indicates that if you're above 5, the child has an unusually high amount of lead in their blood, higher than approximately 98% of all 1 to 5-year-olds in the U.S. Having a blood level above 5 micrograms per deciliter does not mean the child will have significant health effects. But it does mean actions are needed to reduce or stop the child's exposure to lead. Removing lead hazards from the home can stop further exposure, which will allow blood levels to decline. Now, the major sources of lead, where do they come from? Well, the major sources that have been linked to a child's blood lead level are found in homes built before 1978, particularly before 1950, where lead paint can exist and degrade into chips and dust. Lead-contaminated soils, particularly around these older homes pre-1978 or in large urban communities, can be a hazard, a lead hazard for children. Lead from faucets made before 2014, lead from galvanized pipes, lead plumbing can lead to drinking water having lead, and that lead can get into the child's blood. Okay, how does this all sort of work together? Let me introduce the Gingerbread Children. And what you can see is these illustrations show that the chance of a child reaching an elevated blood lead level of 5 micrograms per deciliter it comes together in combination. All children are likely to have some lead at birth from their child's or from their mother's blood. Then add on top of that some of the unavoidable lead that everybody comes in contact with in the air they breathe, the food they eat, and pretty much that amount of dust that everybody can incidentally swallow. So this first child lives in a home where there's very few lead sources. And what it shows is there's a very low risk or a low chance of ever exceeding 5 micrograms per deciliter, that elevated blood lead level. But the second and third children live in these older homes. And in this case, the example that we've built, those homes are actually in reasonably good condition. Those children, though, can experience more lead from the dust in the home or the soils from around the home, as well as older plumbing and fixtures in the home. So as you can see, the combination of lead sources results in the greatest chance of reaching 5 micrograms per deciliter, or that elevated blood lead level. A child has a small chance of having an elevated blood lead level from drinking water alone, until that amount of lead in the drinking water starts to exceed or approach that 15 micrograms of lead per liter of drinking water, that action level. Once you get above that, if you go from 15 to say 30 micrograms per liter in your blood, and it's constantly at 30 in your water, if there's constantly 30 micrograms per liter in the water, okay, of lead, you've now doubled your chance of having that child having an elevated blood lead level. And then if you go all the way up to 100 micrograms per liter in the water, your chance quadruples again. So at some point above 100, water alone could potentially lead to an elevated blood lead level. So I've mentioned a lot of numbers tonight. 15 micrograms per liter of lead in water is the action level used by Eagle to trigger more testing of water supplies. 0 is the amount of lead that the US EPA says is safe in drinking water. In blood, a child with more than 5 micrograms per deciliter of lead in blood has more lead in their blood than 98% of children in the United States, whereas the average child in the US would have less than 1 microgram per deciliter, which no amount of lead in a child's blood is actually safe. With that, Regina, I am going to simply note that we have a hotline and people have questions. They are more than welcome to call the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services. Monday through Friday is a good time, anywhere between 8 and 5. But I will turn it back to you.
Thanks, Corey. I want to introduce our second presenter, Eric Oswald. Eric is the director of the Drinking Water and Environmental Health Division. He'll provide details on the new lead and copper rule.
Thank you, Regina. Thank you, Corey. So if I can get my slides up and we'll get started. Now, before I get started on the details of the new lead and copper rule, I wanted to give some background on the old rule and how it came about and some of the provisions. So to begin with, I wanted to state that this new lead and copper rule is only one of many responses and initiatives the state has taken to reduce lead exposure. There are several ongoing initiatives by the state to control the amount of lead people in Michigan are exposed to. And again, the new lead and copper rule is just one of many efforts designed to reduce lead exposure. So why did we change the lead and copper rules? Well, the lead and copper rule has been around since 1991, so it's 27 years old, 28 years old. And it had some ambiguity, it had some definitions that weren't very good, and it had some issues, other issues with it that we thought were not very protective of public health. And the bottom line was the old rule was not as protective of public health as we thought it was. So how did we decide what we were going to change in the rule? Well, we looked to several sources. Obviously, the Flint water crisis taught us many lessons about problems with the old rule and the way it was implemented. So we looked at the recommendations of the Flint Water Interagency Coordinating Committee and the Advisory Task Force. We also looked to the EPA and some of their recommendations on the lead and copper rule. And we also had a large stakeholder group that gave us very good input on what those stakeholders thought was wrong and how we should change the lead and copper rule. And we also have very experienced staff who have worked with this rule for decades and were very experienced with the shortfalls of the rule and knew where we needed to correct things. So again, as Corey mentioned, the health effects of lead are very well known. The health effects of copper are up there. They don't get as much publicity as lead, but there are still some issues with copper exposure. So overall, it's a good news story of where the nation and the state of Michigan has been with reducing blood lead levels in children. And it's the result of actions that have been taken in the past. If you look here, you see there was a phase out of leaded gasoline. There was a partial lead ban in residences. There was a lead ban in plumbing. And then there was a ban on lead solder and canned foods. Now this is just, and you can see what those efforts did to drive the blood lead level in children down. So we've done a great job with getting average lead levels down, but the goal is 0 here. So we need to do better, and the new lead and copper rule is part of an effort to try and drive those levels even further down. So where does lead come from in your home, in your drinking water? Well, if you look at the water main that's running under the street in front of your home, that water main very rarely contains any amount of lead. There is usually no lead that's produced from the water treatment plant that provides you your water. Where lead starts to be introduced into your drinking water is when it leaves that water main and it enters that line that connects the water main to your home. We call that a service line. And sometimes components or pieces of that service line can be made out of lead. The whole line can be made out of lead, or what we call a gooseneck, where the main connects to the service line, that can be made out of lead. Part of our revision of the rule defines the fact that if any part of that service line is made out of lead, the whole line is considered a lead service line. So that's where lead starts to be introduced into your home. The water stays in contact with that lead material, and it can dissolve, it can break apart and be particulate matter, and it can get into your drinking water that way. There's also the plumbing inside your home. Some of the solder that they use to connect copper pieces together contains lead. Some of the fixtures, some of the brass fixtures, some of the older fixtures can actually contain lead. And then the water stays in contact with that fixture overnight, and it dissolves into the water, and that can expose you to lead. So it's important to understand that there is no lead flowing through the distribution system. It usually comes into the water through the plumbing that's in your home or the service line that serves your home. So the lead and copper rule was enacted in 1991, so it's 28 years old. Michigan incorporated it into their own state Safe Drinking Water Act. And I want to be clear that the lead and copper rule is not a health-based rule. This 15 parts per billion level was not designed as a health-based number. It was a number that indicated to the water treatment system that there was a problem with their corrosion control treatment on their water, and they needed to take a look at that. So the purpose of the lead service line, or the lead and copper rule, was to minimize the corrosivity of the water, to make sure that any metals in contact with that water did not get into the water. It also required sometimes a phosphate or a chemical to be added to the water that would coat these lines to prevent water from coming in contact with them. And again, it established an action level. It's not a maximum contaminant level. It's an action level that, when exceeded, requires the supplies to take certain actions to reduce the corrosivity of their water. So who does the lead and copper rule apply to? Well, as Regina mentioned, it doesn't apply to everyone. It applies to the larger community supplies that provide water to 25 or more people year-round. So there's approximately 1,400 of those supplies in the state of Michigan. It also applies to supplies that serve 25 or more of the same people for more than 6 months of the year. Those are your schools and daycares and larger businesses. And again, there's approximately 1,300. So this rule applies to about 2,700 supplies. It does not apply to small systems that may have a well for a gas station or a church or something like that, or private wells. So what is an action level? There's some confusion over what an action level is. And again, it's a screening tool that the supplies use and that Eagle uses to determine when action is needed to reduce the corrosivity of the water. And again, the action level is based on an ability to reduce that corrosivity. The lead action level for lead currently is 15 parts per billion. We know there's no safe level of lead in the water, so the maximum contaminant level goal for lead is 0. The copper action level is a little higher. It's at 1,300 parts per billion. So an action level exceedance occurs when the 90th percentile value of a water supply exceeds that action level. And there's some confusion. People don't understand that 90th percentile. What does that mean? You hear that a lot in the press. So here's what an action or a 90th percentile level is in a very basic term. So we're going to take a system that takes 10 samples. So if you look on the bottom chart there, you see in the gray, those are the results of the lead testing in homes. So you'll see some zeros, otherwise they determine no lead was present there, and then you see a 2 all the way up to 50. So you arrange the values from lowest to highest, and then you pick the 9th sample, or the 90th percentile sample, and in this case, it's that 13. So what an 90th percentile does not reflect what's flowing. There's, when people hear the action level in a certain community is 6 parts per billion. That doesn't mean there's 6 parts per billion of lead flowing in the water in the distribution system. That means that the 90th percentile sample happened to be 6 parts per billion. So hopefully that explains how we calculate that 90th percentile. So what changes did we make to the lead and copper rule? Well, first, we required a distribution system material inventory. We want systems to know what materials are out in their water distribution system and where those materials are. We required the removal of entire lead service lines at an average rate of 5% per year, unless a supply comes back and has so many lead service lines that it's economically impossible for them to achieve that. Then they'll submit what we call an asset management plan and tell us how they're going to address that, and we'll approve a different timeline. We also banned partial lead service line replacements unless there's an emergency situation. We have found through research that partial lead service line replacements actually create more lead exposure than leaving the entire lead service line in place. And lastly, on lead service line replacement, we've required the supplies to pay for the entire lead service line replacement. It reduces the action level from 15 to 12 by 2025. And it requires a 1st and 5th liter sample at homes with lead service lines, and I'll explain why that is required later. And in the spirit of public participation and transparency, we required advisory councils to be established at any water supply that serves more than 50,000 people, and there is also one at the state level. So this distribution system materials inventory, it is critical that we know what materials are in the distribution system. If you don't know where the lead is present, you can't test at the highest risk locations, and those are usually at single-family homes with a lead service line. So if you don't know where those are, there's no way you can tell where your highest risk is. And again, those 5% removal requirements are based on the total inventory. If you don't know how many lead service lines, it's impossible to calculate 5% and how you can achieve that goal. So on lead service line replacements, obviously there's no better way to reduce risk than getting lead out of the system. We recognize there's a neurotoxin in our distribution system and we have to remove it. Lead exposure can be one event away when there's lead present in the distribution system. In this example, you see a water main running under the street and you see the lead service line connecting the home. Now usually that lead service line is coated with a phosphate or some other chemical that prevents the water from coming in contact and staying in contact with the lead service line. But we found that activities in and around that lead service line can actually dislodge that coating. So if you see the sidewalk and the city comes in and replaces a sidewalk and brings in heavy machinery to break that sidewalk up, that can actually dislodge the coating on that lead service line. And that coating contains lead. That coating can then be taken into the house and stay in particulate matter and create lead exposure for a long period of time. If you don't change the aerators on your faucet, you can have particulate lead sitting there creating an exposure. So the best way to reduce lead exposure is to get rid of the material in our distribution system. So what was wrong with the inventories in the past? We found that a lot of supplies were required to take a certain number of samples. They went out and identified lead service lines in their distribution system up to that number of samples. So say a supply had requirement for 60 samples. They went out and found 60 lead service lines and they stopped. That was the extent of their inventory so that they could meet the requirement of the lead and copper rule to produce 60 samples. Those inventories are now decades old, and the inventories were not provided to the state. So when the state received testing results, the supply would tell us that those were from Tier 1 sites, but we had no way of validating that. So supplies now must periodically review and update and submit to the state those distribution material inventories. And again, the sample sites are supposed to be selected based on the highest risk. And if you don't have a good inventory, you don't know where the highest risk is. So why did we change to 2 samples? Well, in the past, we had what we called the 1st liter sample. So the way this works is the water must be allowed to stagnate or stay in place without any water running in the home for at least 6 hours. And then in the morning, the homeowner would get up, they'd go to their kitchen sink or their bathroom sink and immediately turn on the faucet and run that water into a 1 liter bottle. So that 1 liter tells you what the lead content is of the water that's been in contact with that kitchen faucet. What it didn't tell us is what the lead content was of the water that's been sitting in contact with that lead service line for the 6-hour stagnation time, or for however long that water. And in most cases, that water that's been in contact with the service line has a higher lead content, and it presents a greater exposure risk than that 1st liter sample. And that's a data point that we were missing in the state. And in fact, nationwide, that 5th liter sample is not collected. So the 5th liter sample we anticipate is probably going to be higher than that 1st liter sample. So as an example, here's the picture of the home and where lead comes into contact with your water. The 1st liter sample is right there at the kitchen sink. And that sample gives you an idea of the amount of lead that may be present in the water that's been sitting in contact with your kitchen sink. What it missed is this water here that's been sitting in the lead service line overnight, or for the 6-hour stagnation period. So the 5th liter sample now tells us what the true exposure and what the true amount of lead is in the drinking water. So that's why we're requiring 2 samples. It's definitely more complex than the old method. It's harder than the old method, but we firmly believe it's worth it to get a better idea of what true exposure to lead is in our public water systems. So just in a summary, why did we change the lead and copper rule? Well, we fixed significant issues down to the point where even the definition of what a lead service line was a little bit ambiguous. We fixed that. We made sure that lead is removed by a fixed date. Let's face it, we've been dealing with the lead and copper rule for 28 years, and we haven't made much progress on getting lead out of our drinking water systems. It's time to get the lead out. It also ensures that we know where that lead is, so we ensure that the public water systems are testing at the highest risk locations. And it also requires sampling where we think the highest risk is. And the bottom line is the new rule better protects public health. So if you want to get in contact with Eagle, here's a website that you can reach and a number that you can call. I highly recommend you go to this michigan.gov MyLead website and explore that. There's a lot of very good information on that site for you to use, and a lot of information you can use to reduce your and your children's lead exposure. So thank you for paying attention and participating in this virtual town hall, and I'm going to turn it back to Regina.
Thank you so much, Eric. That's a lot of good information. I want to remind people that you can go to michigan.gov/MI-LeadSafe to submit questions. We have a few questions that have come in already. So Eric and Corey, are you ready?
We're ready.
All right. So the first question is, if I have a lead service line, when can I expect my utility to tell me? And how will my water utility know if I do or do not have a lead service line? So
the distribution system materials inventory is going to require the systems to go out and find these lead service lines. When they find a lead service line, the new rule requires them to notify the resident or the homeowner within 30 days. So if they find a lead service line at your location, you will know within 30 days.
All right, and will water utilities tell customers about the risks of lead service lines so they know to look for those lines, or how does that work?
They are required to, in their public education, if they do have an action level exceedance, there is a requirement for them to put some information out about how to look for lead service lines. And again, with this new materials inventory requirement, we are requiring them to aggressively go out and find these and notify homeowners. So again, I'll point you back to that Michigan MyLeadSafe website. There's a lot of information provided there for you as a homeowner to determine whether you have a lead service line, or to get in contact with your water utility and have them come out and help you identify whether or what material your service line is made of.
And who will be collecting the samples? Like, how will they be collected?
Normally, under the lead and copper rule, the public water supplies have the homeowner take the sample. So what they will do is they will identify homes with a lead service line. They will order a testing kit from the laboratory, which now consists, for homes with a lead service line, of 5 bottles. They will deliver that kit to the homeowner and give the homeowner instructions on how to take that that sample. The homeowner will allow their water to stagnate for the 6-hour period of time, so usually that's overnight. So the first thing in the morning, the homeowner will get up, and before they flush a toilet or take a shower, they go to either a bathroom faucet or the kitchen faucet, and you take your samples, put your lids on your bottle, call the public water supply that your sample kit's ready for pickup. They will pick it up and have that water analyzed for lead and copper content.
Okay, and so if someone wants to collect samples, we have a question, someone is requesting to do that, but they haven't heard anything from their water utility. How do they start the process?
Normally you can get a hold of your water utility and request that they do a sample, and a lot of utilities, I can't speak for all of them, but a lot of utilities will provide that testing if you request it. You can also work with your local health department, and I know Health and Human Services has enhanced services that they can provide as well, so I'll let Corey kind of speak to that.
So during a lead action level exceedance, if the public water supply is unable to, if people are looking to have a filter, we're recommending that any household with a child or a pregnant woman on a public water supply with a lead action level exceedance, get a certified lead filter. And if the public water supply is unable to provide that, we're going to be partnering with the local health department and make available to families who are on Medicaid, WIC, or just at this time are unable to afford the purchase of that filter. They can contact their local health department, and we will make one available to them.
Okay, so one of our questioners wants to know if it's okay for them and their children to drink water if their home has a lead service line.
So in general, it's okay. I would personally advise that they have their water tested. If you have a lead service line, the best thing you can do is to test that water. Ask your public utility to come out in an action level exceedance. Ask for help for that, or you can get in contact with your local health department that can point you in the right direction to test your own lead. You can get the sample kit from the state lab or from another laboratory and test your own water. So we certainly advise that. There are also simple things you can do. The easiest thing you can do if you have a lead service line is to flush your line. Turn your water on. You get up in the morning before you use your water to make coffee or anything else. Take your shower, flush your toilet, let your water run for 3, 4, 5 minutes. Usually a good indicator, if you just stick your hand under the water and you feel it turn cold, that indicates that it's gotten back into the water main where there's no lead present, and you've reduced your chance. Now, you haven't eliminated it. Another thing you can do is clean your aerators out, because a lot of times when particulate lead is released in the system, it'll get onto your aerator and it'll sit there for a while. So another easy thing you can do is take that aerator off, flush it out, then reinstall it and reduce that particulate lead exposure.
Okay, so if someone has an NSF certified filter, will that remove lead? And the website says it needs to be NSF certified. What does that mean?
Maybe the easiest way to describe it, I think we have a slide that might help us sort of identify what this NSF, there we go, thank you so much. So NSF is this third party, a private company that sets up a certification that independently tests various manufacturers of filters, and they will run it through a very rigorous test. It's called the NSF ANSI Standard 53. And when you go look at the back of your box, and you can see this in the lower right hand corner, so the box of the filter, you go to the store, you pick up the filter, turn it over, and you're going to see some sort of mark on the back, whether it's blue or black or the white one in the middle there, a little gold seal. And it's going to have the letters NSF/ANSI Standard 53. But you have to make sure it has the claim and says it reduces lead. So just because it's NSF 53 doesn't mean it's going to reduce lead unless it says for lead or removes lead or reduces lead. You also might see along with the 53 standard, you need the 53. You might also see the number 42. And what the 42 means is that it will also take out particles. And that's also useful because sometimes those particles can have lead with them as well.
Okay. Thank you. We have a question about the timeline. Looks like on one of your slides, Eric, it said that the changes don't take full effect until 2025. What does that mean?
And some changes don't. The drop to 12 parts per billion doesn't come in effect until 2025, and the completion of the lead service, the distribution materials inventory doesn't take effect until 2025. But there are a lot of changes that are in effect now. The new sampling method, the partial lead service line ban, and other changes are in effect now to better protect public health. Now, the reason we delayed some of these is because this is a very aggressive new rule, and it can be costly, and the public water supplies and the municipalities need time to implement this rule. It is not easy to complete a distribution material systems inventory. As you can imagine, they've got to go out and identify all the materials in their distribution system, which contain many hundreds of miles of lines. So we've got to give them adequate time to respond and fulfill that requirement.
Okay. So if the target level of lead in water is 0, then why is the action level higher than 0?
Again, the action level was not intended to be a health-based value. And the problem is it's not practical for these systems to achieve a 0. If you remember the slide that shows the home, the public water supply has no control over the internal plumbing or the fixtures. And even after 2014, when you have a lead-free fixture, it says lead-free, but there is still an allowable lead content in that fixture. So as you can imagine, if water stays in contact with even a low level of lead, you're still going to get a lead result. So that's why the standard wasn't set at 0.
Okay. Are there any changes to the action levels for copper?
No, there were no changes to the copper action level under the new lead and copper rule.
So back to filters. Where can people find filters?
Well, for those who want to use the internet, that's always a good place to start, using those letters NSF, ANSI, 53, lead, filter, will bring up a variety of options. Or any really big box store, hardware store, otherwise will likely have these filters. And you can, again, look for those indicators on the box, NSF 53, and that will get you the filter. Comes in a fairly small box, about 8 inches by 8 inches. It attaches to your faucet. They run around, cost-wise, probably around $30, give or take. And then the replacement cartridges, maybe around $10 or so. Then they last 1 to 3 months, depending on how much you use it.
So how does it work if you have a pitcher?
So in some cases, if you don't want to attach it, or maybe you can't because you have a faucet, it just doesn't allow you to attach it to the end of your faucet at your kitchen sink. There are pitchers so that you can simply run the water into the pitcher. There's a filter in the pitcher, but when you buy the pitcher, you still got to look for that same thing. You got to look for that NSF symbol. It has to say NSF 53 for lead. It has to say removes lead or reduces lead. But pitchers can work as well.
Okay. So I want to thank you, Corey and Eric, for joining me. This has been very informative, and thank you, everyone, for joining us to really learn more about the changes in the lead and copper rule. As a reminder, we'll be hosting our third virtual town hall tomorrow evening at 6 o'clock. Again, you go to michigan.gov/MI lead safe. And we will also be posting recordings of last night's town hall, tonight's town hall, and tomorrow's town hall. So there'll be plenty of opportunities for you to learn more about the changes in the lead and copper rule. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.